What happens when arrogance meets hidden talent? A billionaire, used to owning every room he enters, laughed as he dared a simple waitress to dance. But what happened next left the entire crowd speechless, and him frozen in his tracks. Stay with me till the end of this story, because it will not only move your heart but also remind you never to underestimate anyone. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Goodness Corner for more inspiring stories that touch the soul. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers that dripped light like liquid gold. It was the night of the charity gala, where the city's elite gathered not only to flaunt their wealth but to bask in admiration. Among them was Alexander Kane, the billionaire whose name was whispered with awe and envy alike. He was tall, striking, and carried an air of untouchable arrogance, the kind that made everyone around him feel small, whether he intended it or not. For him, life was a game, and people were merely pieces on his board. Tonight was no different. He had already made his grand entrance, shaking hands with politicians, exchanging smirks with rival tycoons, and sipping his wine like the king of a private kingdom. But fate has its peculiar ways of reminding us that pride is fragile. Near the edges of the ballroom, where the velvet curtains fell heavy and shadows dimmed the glow, waiters and waitresses moved quietly with trays of champagne and appetizers. Among them was a young woman named Clara. She was not dressed in diamonds, nor wrapped in satin gowns like the ladies who turned heads with every movement. Her uniform was plain, her hair neatly tied back, her face devoid of lavish makeup. Yet there was a light in her eyes, subtle, resilient, and strangely magnetic, like a candle flame in the wind refusing to be extinguished. Alexander noticed her when she nearly bumped into him with her tray. His wine sloshed, a few drops spilling dangerously close to his tailored suit. Gasps rippled among the guests. Clara quickly steadied herself and whispered an apology, her voice calm, respectful, and steady despite the piercing stares. Something about her composure irritated Alexander. No trembling, no groveling, she simply moved on with dignity. And that, in his world, was unusual. Moments later, as the orchestra struck a lively tune and couples began swirling across the floor, Alexander leaned back in his chair, surrounded by his circle of admirers. His eyes landed on Clara again as she moved across the hall, her steps graceful despite carrying a heavy tray. An idea, born out of arrogance and the desire to amuse his companions, formed in his mind. With a smug smile, he raised his glass and called out, "You there, the waitress." "Yes, you. Tell me, do you dance?" The entire table fell silent. Heads turned. Clara froze, tray still in hand, uncertain if she had heard him correctly. Heat flushed her cheeks as laughter bubbled around her. She wanted to disappear, but Alexander's commanding gaze pinned her in place. "Well," he pressed, standing tall now, his voice booming across the music. "Surely you know a step or two. Come then, let's see what talent the staff of this fine hotel can offer." The guests chuckled, some in amusement, others in discomfort. Everyone expected Clara to refuse, to lower her head and back away. It was, after all, absurd. This was a billionaire's gala, not a stage for a waitress. But Clara surprised them. She set down her tray on a side table, lifted her chin, and with the faintest trace of a smile, said softly, "If you insist, sir." The room gasped. The boldness of her answer was electric, a crackle that silenced the orchestra mid-note. Alexander arched an eyebrow, intrigued. He had expected fear, not courage. He offered his hand mockingly, and Clara placed hers in his without hesitation. Together they stepped onto the polished dance floor under the chandelier's glow. At first, Alexander led with dramatic flourishes, confident that he would outshine her. He moved with practiced skill. After all, he had been trained in the finest ballrooms, partnered with professional dancers, and dazzled countless women with his charm. He thought this would be no different. A quick dance, a little show, and everyone would laugh at the waitress who dared share the stage with him. But then something shifted. The music swelled, and Clara's steps began to speak. She moved not with the stiffness of someone trying to keep up, but with the ease of someone born to rhythm. Her body flowed with the music, her turns precise yet effortless, her gaze steady and unafraid. In that moment, the ballroom no longer saw a waitress, they saw an artist. Whispers spread like wildfire. The crowd leaned closer, their eyes widening with every move. Alexander, for the first time in years, felt himself falter. He tried to lead, but Clara anticipated his steps, twirling just beyond his control, moving with a confidence that stole the spotlight from him. Her every gesture told a story of strength, of nights spent unseen, of a soul that refused to bow down no matter how invisible the world tried to make her. By now, the guests were no longer laughing. They were mesmerized. The orchestra, catching the fire in her movements, played with renewed passion, their strings and notes chasing her across the floor. Alexander's smugness melted, replaced by something unfamiliar, nervousness. He realized, painfully, that he was no longer the star of this spectacle. The billionaire, the man who commanded boardrooms and governments, froze on the floor as Clara spun with the elegance of someone who had found her true stage. He struggled to keep up, missing steps, his rhythm faltering. The crowd began to murmur, admiration for Clara, disbelief for him. The mockery had reversed. For the first time in his life, Alexander Kane knew what it felt like to be overshadowed. And it terrified him. When the music reached its climax, Clara ended with a breathtaking turn and a graceful bow. The room erupted into thunderous applause, cheers echoing off the marble walls. She stood tall, her chest heaving, her eyes bright, while Alexander stood beside her, stiff and shaken, his pride shattered. Clara quietly stepped back, retrieved her tray, and returned to her duties as though nothing had happened. But the guests would not forget. The billionaire had dared the waitress to dance, and she had stolen not just the spotlight, but the very air in the room. And friends, if this story has already captured your heart, imagine what lies ahead in Chapter 2. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Goodness Corner, because stories like these remind us that true worth has nothing to do with wealth or power, it lives in the courage to rise when least expected. The applause still echoed in Alexander Kane's ears long after the orchestra had stopped playing. He had stood frozen on that marble floor, his carefully cultivated image cracking before the very eyes of his peers. For years, he had been untouchable, the man who dictated the terms of every room he entered. But tonight, in front of politicians, actors, business magnates, and socialites, he had been humbled, not by a rival, not by a CEO, but by a waitress. He sat down heavily, his glass of wine trembling in his hand, his eyes unwillingly drawn to Clara as she quietly moved among the guests once more. She seemed utterly unfazed by what had just happened, as though it had been the most ordinary thing in the world. That composure only unsettled him further. But the crowd had changed. Where once the spotlight belonged to him, it now followed her. Guests whispered not about Alexander's fortune, but about Clara's astonishing grace. Some approached her shyly, thanking her for the performance. Others watched in admiration, wondering who she was and how she had learned to dance like that. Alexander's pride burned hotter with every passing moment, but alongside that fire flickered something else, curiosity. When the gala drew to a close, Alexander found himself waiting near the service exit. The cool night air bit at his skin, but he stayed, determined. At last, Clara stepped outside, her shift complete, her uniform coat wrapped tightly around her. She looked startled to find him there, leaning against his sleek black car, his usual aura of confidence dimmed but not extinguished. "You shouldn't sneak up on people like that," she said calmly, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. Alexander gave a strained smile. "You shouldn't outshine billionaires on the dance floor, but here we are." She tilted her head, neither intimidated nor impressed. "You dared me. I only accepted." Her words cut through his pride like glass. He had meant it as a game, a spectacle for others to laugh at. Yet she had turned the tables, showing a strength that unsettled him. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't know what to say. He searched her face, trying to understand her, and finally asked, "Where did you learn to dance like that?" Clara hesitated, then gave a small, wistful smile. "My mother taught me. She used to be a dancer before she got sick. We didn't have much, but we had music, and we had movement. It kept us alive when the world tried to crush us." There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet resilience. Alexander felt something stir in him, something he hadn't felt in years: humility. "And now?" he asked. "Now I work," she said simply. "To pay bills, to survive. Dancing is just part of me. It doesn't matter if I'm wearing a gown or carrying a tray." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. For Alexander, who had spent his life measuring worth in money and influence, her perspective was like ice water poured over a fevered mind. He realized with sudden clarity how small he had become, despite his vast wealth, compared to the courage and dignity standing before him. For weeks after the gala, Alexander couldn't shake Clara from his thoughts. The newspapers had feasted on the story: billionaire dared waitress to dance, lost spotlight instead. Headlines mocked him, social media replayed the footage endlessly, but curiously, Alexander found himself less concerned with his humiliation and more fascinated by Clara herself. He attended another gala, then another, but none of the women he danced with moved with her fire. None carried themselves with her quiet strength. He began searching for her, not as a challenge to his pride, but as a man desperately seeking something he had never known he lacked. Eventually, he found her again, working a late shift at a small cafe tucked away from the city's chaos. She looked surprised to see him, but not impressed, not flattered, simply unsurprised, as though she had expected this moment to arrive one day. "You don't give up easily, do you?" she said, pouring coffee for a table of students. "Not when something matters," Alexander replied, his voice softer now, stripped of its usual bravado. Over time, conversations bloomed between them. He listened to her stories, about her mother, about her struggles, about nights when she practiced dance alone in the dim light of her tiny apartment, not for applause, but for survival of the spirit. She listened, too, to his tales of wealth and emptiness, of victories that felt hollow, of boardrooms where every smile was a mask. Their worlds were galaxies apart, yet in those conversations, they found a rare honesty. But still, a question haunted Clara. Why was Alexander drawn to her? Was it curiosity, guilt, or something deeper? She finally asked him one evening as they walked along the river, city lights shimmering on the water. "You could have anyone," she said softly. "Why bother with me?" Alexander paused, his hands resting against the railing, his gaze distant. "Because with everyone else, I know what to expect. Polished manners, rehearsed laughter, admiration because of my name, not me. With you, I froze, Clara. Not because you humiliated me, but because you showed me something real. You made me remember I'm human, not just a title." Her heart stirred at his words, but caution lingered. She had seen men like him before, powerful, charming, fleeting. Yet there was a tremor in his voice, a vulnerability that made her wonder if perhaps this time was different. Their bond grew slowly, not as a whirlwind romance, but as two souls learning from one another. Clara taught Alexander the value of silence, of simplicity, of working for something without expecting applause. Alexander, in turn, opened doors for her, not with arrogance, but with sincerity, supporting her dream to one day open a small dance studio for children who couldn't afford lessons. He funded it quietly, insisting it was not charity, but an investment in beauty the world desperately needed. Months later, the studio opened in a modest neighborhood. Clara stood at the doorway, watching children laugh and twirl, their joy filling the air. Alexander stood beside her, not as a billionaire flaunting his wealth, but as a man quietly proud to have been part of something that mattered. The world would always remember the night a billionaire froze on the dance floor, but for Clara and Alexander, that moment had become something greater. It was the night arrogance collided with humility, and both were transformed. So, dear friends, if you've stayed with me till now, remember this: greatness is not in money or power, but in the courage to step forward when someone dares you to shrink. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Goodness Corner for more true and inspiring tales that remind us of the beauty hidden in unexpected places.